In this video, I want to show you how to make an absolute classic looking Lord of the Rings style fantasy world map. You don't have to have any drawing experience, and it's actually pretty easy to do. Now, lots of amazing artists have made maps of Middle-earth, but the ones that I kind of remember and think are the most authentic are the ones in the paperback books by Tolkien's son, Christopher. You know, when I think of a Lord of the Rings map, these are the maps that I think of. Maybe the movie maps too, but especially these. The maps are simple, but they're also evocative enough that I get excited thinking about exploring Middle-earth using my imagination. And the cool thing about this simplified style of map is that it's easy to draw. It's easy to replicate. So even if you have absolutely zero artistic experience, zero drawing experience, all you'll really need are a few tools, a little bit of patience, and your imagination to make a totally awesome Lord of the Rings style world map. Okay, so first off, let's talk tools. You'll need a pencil and an eraser, some pens. You can use any black ink pen, but I like to use these Pigma Micron pens because they come in a few different sizes and make really reliable uniform lines. This one's optional, but a red pen to do the lettering is gonna look super cool. And you're also gonna need just some plain white paper. Don't worry if you don't have all of this stuff readily available. I'll have links down in the description to where you can get all this stuff. Now, before we jump right into illustrating an awesome looking map, we gotta figure out how to illustrate each of the individual elements that will combine to create this fantasy world map. Now, I have a map of Eriador open from the back of the book, and I'm just spending a little bit of time picking out the individual elements and redrawing them myself, figuring out how to draw each of these little icons. So I'm starting with the mountains. They're basically just upside down V's. I'm varying the size of the mountains a little bit and overlapping them to create a mountain range. Then I'm just coloring in the left side of each mountain to add a little bit of depth and shadow. Hills are basically the same as mountains, but, shallow mounds instead of tall and pointy. They still get the same shadow treatment on the left side. Forests are simple circles or ovals with little single line trunks. The trees on the map are really crammed together, so they all touch and overlap, and only the bottommost trees of a forest have their trunks showing. The rest of the circles are overlapped and kind of recede behind that front row. Marshes are these little W kind of things, like one vertical line with two diagonal lines coming out of each side. I think these are really fun to draw over and over again, even though they barely appear in the Lord of the Rings maps. Towns and cities are super easy. They're just a filled in square. And bridges, well, rivers are just wavy, solid lines, and bridges go over. They're like two parallel lines, and then they have little angled lines going out from each end. Like the river, coastlines are like thicker outlines. I'm using a thicker pen to do the rivers and coastline. And then the ocean is indicated by thinner lines that follow the contour of the coast, but they get more and more spread out the further out they go. And finally, roads are just small dashed or dotted lines. Really, really simple. Now, even though all of these elements are really easy to draw and you might feel like you can just jump straight into drawing your map, I super recommend just taking a few minutes to draw each of the individual elements on a separate scrap sheet of paper. I promise you it'll save time in the long run, and it'll give you a lot of confidence as you jump into staring at a blank page and trying to illustrate a world map from nothing. Okay, now I'm gonna jump onto a fresh sheet of paper, and with a pencil, I'm gonna plan out my own fantasy world map. Now, what I'm sketching out is kind of similar to Eriador, where the Fellowship of the Ring takes place. I'm starting with a coastline and then adding mountains and forests and rivers and towns where they make sense, and then connecting them with roads. I'm just kind of making this up as I go, but if you have a story you've written or a tabletop role-playing game campaign that you want to run, and you have ideas about what this world looks like and how things are laid out, this is the time that you really try and figure out where all of your main locations in your story or your game are located in comparison to one another. And I'm using a pencil and an eraser so I can easily change up details when I need to. You know, it's kind of empowering to just take a couple of swipes of your eraser and be able to move an entire mountain range to someplace else in the world. Okay, now I'm naming some of the locations, and I'm just taking parts of the words that I see on the Eriador map and kind of reformulating, recombining them myself. I know that Tolkien was a stickler for naming things, so I hope I'm not making any Middle-earth fans upset by changing this stuff. I'm just being inspired by some of my favorite maps in the back of some of my favorite books. And you know, this is all just for fun and learning anyway. Now, you might get a little hung up on the lettering process. I've made an entire video about this. The link is popping up in the corner right now. I feel like lettering is a really big part of the Middle-earth maps, and honestly, taking a look at these maps like reproduced in the back of these paperback books, I feel like things were shrunken down and maybe some things were re-lettered. It's actually kind of hard to read. So for my map, I'm keeping everything spare and simple, and the main thing is I'm keeping the letters for each of the elements consistent. So towns all have the same size letters and the same size spacing, and the bigger areas like the forests and the mountains, those labels get a little bit bigger, and then the name for the whole map, the entire region of the world, is the biggest and the most spread out. Now you can tell at this pencil stage, not everything is completely drawn out. You know, mountains aren't shaded in, forests are just blobs instead of each individual tree. It's just enough to feel comfortable for me to add ink to it. And because I did that step at the beginning where I made the key on the separate sheet of paper, I didn't feel like I needed to draw each and every individual element in pencil first before going to ink. And speaking of going into ink, I'm going to start by inking the letters. So I'm very lightly erasing because I'm worried that some of the pencil is going to show through the red ink of my red Sharpie pen, but I've left just enough to see the words to be able to ink over top of them. And now that I'm moving into ink, I can no longer erase. I'm taking much more time. I'm being much more patient with my drawing, and I'm doing my absolute best to keep things really consistent. You know, the lettering I'm doing here isn't as nice and perfect as it is in the Christopher Tolkien maps, but I am keeping things neat, and it is easy enough to read and has enough flavor that it feels right on a fantasy map. So when I'm labeling a map, hopefully this makes sense, I really think about drawing the letters instead of writing the letters. It's a small distinction, but it helps me think about, you know, making sure the A is as wide as the D and the O, and there's enough space in between each letter and all of that stuff. Okay, now all the lettering is done. I'm moving on to the border. I'm using a size 12 micron. This is the biggest micron I have. You know, I want this map to be sealed in with the thickest line I can make. I probably should have used a ruler to make nice straight lines like the Lord of the Rings map, but I decided just to go freehand. And then I'm adding another smaller, thinner line with my size 8 micron around the outside, just to add a little bit of extra detail and make it look like the Christopher Tolkien map. Okay, now I'm jumping to a size 10 micron for the coasts and rivers. I'm doing those first. And the cool thing about these Lord of the Rings maps is they're so zoomed out, you don't have to feel like you gotta get the coast looking all jagged and perfect like an actual coastline looks. It can be a little more abstract, same as the rivers. They don't have to wind and weave around like real rivers do because we're so zoomed out. We're like looking at this map from outer space. Okay, now it's time to get into the really fun stuff. I've moved down to an 0.5 micron size, and I'm starting to ink just the rest of the map, the mountains and the forests and the towns. And usually I tend to fill up my maps, like absolutely cramming them with as many icons and interesting places as I can. But the Lord of the Rings maps always have such wonderful negative space. There's like clusters of busy places for sure, especially with all the labels and lettering. But because this map is really focused on showing space. Like the map I'm referencing, the northwestern part of the west part of Middle Earth is like literally 1,000 miles. It's almost like the mountains on this map are the actual size of the mountains. And obviously the trees aren't the actual size of trees, but they do make up the forest that are the actual size of the forest, 100 or 200 mile across forests. And I really think this is a great style of map for drawing a fantasy world, whether it's for your D&D or tabletop RPG table, or for the world that you've come up with for your own novel. This style of map really leaves a lot to the imagination, and it's more about showing distances between the places than it is about illustrating some fantasy location. Like we have no idea the difference between the town of Farden and Scarbad, or the difference between the Mythwood or the Carndale Forest. We'd have to play the game or read the novel to find out, and that sort of thing is really, really exciting. I've decided to add a compass rose into the bottom corner just by tracing a pin cap and then dividing it into equal sections. This is just a little finishing touch to the drawing to make it really feel like a map. Now, I really, really hope you give making this Lord of the Rings style map a try. The process is super fun. It's actually really easy. And it just feels amazing to create an entire world in your imagination and then turn it into something real by drawing the map. Now, if you feel like you still need some more help drawing your fantasy maps, I got lots of other videos on the channel, and I've also made multiple guidebooks for drawing maps and dungeons and monsters, all kinds of stuff. You can get these in my online shop. They're also available digitally if you join my Patreon. All the links are in the description. Let me know what you think of my bootleg Lord of the Rings map down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. See ya!